Linneaus in Lapland by Lorine Niedecker. I'm Hannah.
I'm Michael.
I'm Selena. And I'm India.
And I think Selena's going to read the whole poem now.
Okay. Linneaus in Lapland. Nothing worth noting except an Andromeda with quadrangular shoots, the boots of the people. Wet inside, they must swim to church through the floods or be taxed, the blossoms from the blossoms of the leaves. Fog thick morning, I see only where I now walk. I carry my clarity with me. Here, where her snow grave is, the you of morning doves.
Thanks, Selena. So now I think we're just going to take it stanza by stanza, and we'll each talk a little bit about our stanza, and then open it up to kind of final thoughts and reflections.
Cool. Okay, so why don't we just quickly start with the title, Linneaus in Lapland, because obviously she's referencing something or someone, and Linneaus was, what's his first name? Carl Linneaus was this famous explorer, expeditionist, so he was a botanist and was very interested in zoology, and from Sweden, and famously did an expedition to Lapland. So that's a very specific reference to one historical figure, which I think is very needed.
And so he was like an 18th century natural philosopher, and what he's most famous for is categorizing and classifying plants and animals.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also important.
And one of the things that I think is going to come up later too is that Linneaus really focused on how very small elements of zoology or biology or archaeology, like for example teeth, could be used to mark difference and sort of like backwrite the history of an animal or a thing. So that's going to come up a little bit, I think.
And one other thing I also learned about Linneaus and plants is that he classified plants in terms of their sexual organs. So for Linneaus, plants are sort of like distinguished by how they reproduce.
That's fascinating.
So we're like sort of already in a gender zone.
Inescapably.
Yeah.
I think that'll come up really well if you want to talk about the Andromeda reference that actually worked.
Yeah, so should we just dive into that first stanza?
Sure, so just rereading it, maybe nothing worth noting except an Andromeda with quadrangular shoots, the boots of the people. So I thought it had a really rhythmic sound to it, and that first line, nothing worth noting, that kind of illustration of the diphthong sound was really interesting, and also recalled for me anyway that other poem by Niedecker, You Are My Friend, where she talks about nothing in it, this with the boot as well. She talks about you patching my boot and nothing in it except my hand. So it's I thought it was interesting that it recalled that, but also Andromeda as a figure was a character in Greek mythology, and as far as I know, her name has a sort of negative connotation towards men, which is very interesting from a gender perspective. But also here, I think, obviously we're in Lapland, it could refer to the Andromeda constellation in the sky, but also could, because of Linneaus being obviously a botanist, refer to a plant. And I think, Hannah, you mentioned that you know of a particular plant genus that it's referencing.
I looked this up. Andromeda is the Latin name for bog rosemary, which is a very small, delicate plant that grows in peat bogs and cold areas. And it has a very delicate, like pinkish white flower that looks a little bit like a tooth.
Okay.
Actually,
that's interesting.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
So there's this Andromeda. So if we imagine that we're in the character of Linneaus, looking around, saying that there's nothing worth noting except an Andromeda, except maybe this plant that he finds on the ground with quadrangular shoots, and then immediately references the boots of the people. So as you were saying, he hones in on small elements, and there's possibly a degree to which he's identifying these plants with, or seeing people in the same kind of anthropological, zoological, sort of biological way that he's seeing the shoots as well, kind of the way that it automatically jumps, and with that reviewed that assonance as well really ties those two lines together. Another thing just worth mentioning about the Andromeda is that as a character in Greek mythology, she was victimized by, I think she was chained to a rock and had to be rescued by someone, Perseus, I think. So there's this also victim figure in her character, and I don't know how that will relate to the poem as a whole. And then thinking about also the boots of the people, this for me it ties Linneaus to Niedecker, and the poem to Niedecker in a really specific way because of her kind of already seen empathy in other poems with the people, with the kind of poems like A Country's Economic Sick. She references the people specifically, and poems like Foreclosure, where she talks about the kind of the poverty, the state of things. Maybe that's a good point to run on to the next stanza, which was Michael.
Yeah, so it's interesting to use the word run because like the stanzas are broken, but they definitely run together here, right? But then also they are broken because the whole first section of the poem is essentially one sentence, right? So we go on that run from nothing worth noting except an Andromeda with quadrangular shoots, M dash, the boots of the people wet inside, they must swim to church through the floods or be taxed, M dash, the blossoms from the bosoms of the leaves. So that second stanza sort of continues that break and that jump from looking at the Andromeda to this sort of meditation on the boots. Of course, I kind of think of Heidegger there a little bit, but I don't think that's quite what Niedecker's doing. I think this is a really interesting poem for her because it does feel distinct from a lot of her other work that's so non-referential, right? This and this sort of invocation of Linneaus at the beginning feels much more like something like HD, right?
I think she kind of did a series, didn't she? A historical series with Darwin as well. But it's I've never read anything from that, so I think this is really interesting to see.
Yeah. So in that second stanza, we continue that jump, right, from the boots to the people, and we're in what feels to me like very much the world of Niedecker, right? Like economic oppression, dailiness, poverty,
dampness,
right? Damp, like thinking about like where she lived in Wisconsin, for sure.
Which was near a lake or a river.
Yeah.
Anyway, there were floods.
Right.
That's a common religion,
right.
isn't it?
Yeah.
And she talks about the floods here too. And so it's this weird jump because I don't think we're in Lapland anymore. I think we're back in Wisconsin, maybe, right?
I think something that really supports the idea that we're not in Lapland, just the reference to a church, just mentioning a church, would be quite unlikely that there are not a lot of churches.
Lapland is like a wild, natural place, right?
That's my sense.
I had a point in Jamaica just about the church taxes because I just remembered this weird fact about how in Denmark they tax people on their incomes to go to church, and if you don't get taxed, you have to pay a church tax, and if you don't pay the church tax, then you have to pay an income tax to pay an increase in income tax. So that's how I looked it up. To see if it was common in Sweden
today?
and Finland as well, and it's still and it's true today as well.
Wow.
So I think the fact that they have to go and be taxed for going to church is actually a specific reference to that taxation on income. So clearly she's really identifying with the economic situation in this remote place in Lapland as well. But anyway, that was one reading.
No,
I think that's really interesting. I think the other thing I'm curious about is how much she really knew about that, because the way it works is that you actually it sort of works out at the end of your life, because you're being taxed not really to attend church and that sort of things like that, but it reduces the cost for a marriage license or for a funeral, having a burial, anything that the church will perform some of those services. and they sort of have saved that money to use for the people in the towns. I'm curious if there's a contrast of what would she have known, because the way a lot of American taxes work, that money is gone, and maybe you don't personally see
But
any
this is
benefit
still,
from it, but this might be something
it's
different.
still like within the
In the
time
community.
when you can see what's
Mhm.
actually happened to it.
Yeah. No, that's all really interesting. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're not in Sweden or in Wisconsin here. Maybe we are in Sweden.
Maybe,
But
but
it's maybe. But I think it sort
Yeah.
of invokes for me a lot of that sort of Wisconsin life, right? And again, like kind of like the floods,
Well,
right, which are so central in Edgar's
then too, like,
imagination.
I'm also imagining, I don't know this for sure, but were there not like a lot of Swedish immigrants settling in like the West and Midwest?
Yeah, I think you might
I
be
do
right.
not know that.
Just thinking like, you know, Willa Cather, like my Antonia, it's not Wisconsin, it's like the sort of like wild, like big West country. Yeah.
That's true.
So
So what my main takeaway from that section though is that she sort of starts to replicate, I think, the Linneaus method when she's talking about the boots, right? Because she's not, I mean, the idea that they have to swim to church because the floods would be taxed, she seems to get this from the fact that the boots are wet inside, right? But I'm not sure that she can know that necessarily, but she seems to be doing that sort of Linnaeus, you know, using the small to create the big, but not on the natural world, on the human world, right? And sort of thinking about the human life, especially sort of the oppressed, the lower class life, from these small objects to give birth to this larger vision of the families,
Yeah.
with people having to swim to church.
She does this flitting back and forth between the natural the character of Linneaus, between the natural world and the human world, and from shoots to boots, and it's done through these chiastic kind of structures as well. And then the colon, so you've got, and then the blossoms to the bosoms, back to the leaves again. He
Right.
seems to be kind of, there's this kind of constant identification of nature with humanity.
yeah, so it's like
as well.
there's a personal element, there's a communal element, and there's a natural element, and they're like very thickly kind of like meshed together, I think.
And at the same time though, they kind of stand alone too, right? Because that's such a long sentence and it has like the you know, the colon inside, like it's not really a proper sentence, but it operates as one thought, but with so much jumbled in that when you get to the end, which should be the close of that first sentence, right, going back to the shoots, I don't read it that way, or I don't feel it that way. I just get this little image of like the blossoms from the bosoms of the leaves, and so it's both like dense and heavy, and then it sort of like disappears, and we just have that little image.
Can you say a little more about the last two lines of that stanza?
Sure. Well, I love the sound of it more than anything, right?
Yeah.
That almost identical rhyme, right? Like really, really close. Blossom, bosom. You know, and when you look at it on the page, it's two letters off, and they're directly. Obviously, whoever's watching this can't see it, but they're like directly, you know, vertically beneath each other.
Yeah.
It's paralleling the last three lines of the previous one as well.
Right.
Shoots and
Shoots, boots, people. Yeah. So she's doing that sort of almost visual, right?
Yeah, shoots and boots and floods.
And that inverted structure as well, the way that the lines kind of are laid out on the page, is reminiscent of other poems of hers. She seems to do that quite a lot, like Grandfather Advised Me as well, kind of made up of this sort of kind of...
Yeah, it definitely, it looks like a Niedecker poem to me, right? It has this sort of mode, but just the sound of that carries me through the blossoms and the bosoms of the leaves. And she's done so much work to sort of get you inside the mind of the shoes and the boots that I almost feel like the blossoms are on the bottom of the boots. That is also part of the sort of scene she's looking at.
Oh, like maybe someone
like,
stepped on this delicate flower in this unstable, boggy ground.
And she's sort of using that to think about Linnaeus and Lapland and think about the Andromeda. Maybe.
And if the boots are wet and he was sort of going and observing things and collecting things, with a wet shoe is going to actually pick up whatever's on the ground.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have this really strong tie between like the physical and the human physical and the natural physical.
And this sense of like the underfoot, I think, is really important.
Yeah, because the people are underfoot too.
Yeah.
Right, in a way.
Like downtrodden.
Yeah, that's how I feel
That's
it.
interesting. That's a really nice metaphor.
Yeah, that is great. Are you guys
that's
ready to move on to the
Yeah,
next?
yeah.
Let's move.
Yeah, so that idea of like the underfoot kind of informs how I look at this next stanza. The fog thick morning, I see only where I now walk. I carry my clarity with me. So this kind of situates us in a particular moment, and a moment that's like completely circumscribed visually by fog. So the person, Linneaus, I guess, walking around in the bog, can't see can't see his hand in front of his face. I can only see where I now walk. And that line, I carry my clarity with me, sort of like sends me back to the intense focusing that was happening at the very beginning of the poem.
Mm-hmm. And that's very her as well, the condensatory.
Yes, and what does fog do? It condenses on things, right?
Yeah.
So there's a sort of condensation of like an atmosphere and a condensation of attention, and the attention is directed to what's underfoot because like we can't really see where we're going. Yeah. Yeah,
well, I wondered if that was sort of maybe a rejoinder to the first section, right? Because in the first section and the Linneaus method, we seem to think like what you can see can transport you to a larger picture. And this stanza seems to be saying no, right? I see only where I now walk. But I don't know that we can believe that because I can see the people swimming through the floods. Like, that seems to be the work of poetry.
And then there's, I can't see where I'm going, but I carry my clarity with me. There's a sort of separation between, an interior clarity and an exterior obscurity here, which I think is interesting because Linneaus is all about seeing clearly the object that's, there on the ground in front of us. This is sort of suggesting to me that, like, we can get to clarity by looking inside ourselves.
Do we think this is Niedecker's voice definitely coming in after Linneaus' voice, or who's the speaker, who is the I in this?
I'm not sure.
I don't know. Because we have that asterisk break, right?
Yes.
So there's reason to believe it's a different speaker.
Right.
And then the fact that it seems to be a rejection of Linneaus' method, but it doesn't have to be.
But then if he's walking in Lapland and it's fog thick morning and he's looking still on the ground, it seems, to be. I also thought just the fog thick morning is so that Niedeckerian, that epithet, that condensed, invented this fog thick. It's definitely the kind of clarity that she's striving for in this stanza, and it's very so it's sort of representing her poetry in itself as well.
It's the clarity by obscurity too, right? The fog so thick you can't see.
Yeah.
There's also kind of like dwindling that happens in this poem that's really interesting. Like, we move from real like density of detail, like density of impression in the first stanza, or the first moment of the poem, that 2-stanza chunk, and then the next 2 stanzas are extremely condensed, very brief, and lead us into like more and more mysterious places, I think. So like in sort of like narrowing the focus and sort of like dwindling, like a dwindling of like available perceptions, something else is happening. So maybe we need to push forward.
Yes, I think if we look at the last stanza, that may actually give us some insight into the speaker and to some of these themes that I think we can tie together. The way I saw it is that this third stanza is Niedecker's, or is more of Niedecker's voice, and then it switches again for the last stanza, and we'll see when we sort of talk through this if you guys actually see that switch or not. Because what I think is really interesting is at the end of the third stanza, we've had all these I see, I now, I carry, and then we have my clarity and with me. And then that sort of ends, and then we start the last stanza with an imperative, with here. And I felt like that has a very loaded meaning if you think about it in the Linneaus terms of he's in Lapland, in sort of 2 ways, of it being this frozen tundra. It's very quiet, the snow and everything's blanketed, it's winter, it's frozen, and he's out there alone exploring. And it also seems to have a sort of loaded cultural meaning. Denmark, Sweden, Finland, these sort of places where people tend to be more to themselves, and this idea of condensory in speech and in social interaction tend to be very reserved and sort of limit this small talk, these extra conversations that we as Americans love to do. Hey, how you doing? How's it going today? They don't really do that. So commanding someone to hear what? Maybe there's nothing there, maybe there's nothing to hear in this area with these people. Maybe that silence is really the important part that's condensing something that is there into something more useful, which maybe Niedecker is sort of taking.
I just realized that I miscopied that I wrote H-E-R-E.
But I think it is a pun there. I think it could be punning.
No, I think so too.
Oh, that's good.
Because this stanza is littered with puns.
Yes.
That's true.
There's the morning and the morning
Right.
of the previous.
Yes.
And the repetition
And the structure of the sentence, right? Here, where her snow grave is, like,
right.
it is literally an imperative, right? Like, listen where it is.
Yeah.
But that sort of reverses the sense that you should be thinking, like, here's where it is.
Yeah.
But it's
you
not.
don't listen to where something is, do
Right.
you? You have to
Right.
you have to have some kind of locus, some prepositional kind of sense.
So how about all of these pronouns? Like, who is her? Like, who is you?
Right.
How you?
This is what I think is really interesting, and this is sort of, maybe this is a really big stretch, but I was going to take it back to the Andromeda, and if we wanted, because we felt like maybe that didn't totally fit the idea of this female sort of victimized, alone, lonely, sort of stuck there sort of person. If we took that a little further, the snow grave being again the place where there's all the snow.
Well, yeah, the flowers grave as well.
It seems to be a very feminine imagery.
Yes, definitely.
And then there's another, right after that, that's something we have to look at is the U, the capital U, and the ah U. Who is the you, or what is the relationship between those?
Right.
There's also like a really rich sort of elusive tradition around like the language of birds in poetry. Like I don't know, is it like Wagner or something, where like the hero like drinks some like dragon's blood and then he's able to hear what the birds are saying. Is that? It's maybe a little bit far-fetched, but like when I think about Linneaus believed that you could sort of extrapolate like the wonders of God's creation by looking at the natural world. So already like this is a really charged natural imagery. Like there's this idea that there is like meaning, language inherent in what we can see and like the noises of animals that we hear.
Right. Which is I found so interesting, right? Because I grew up in a family where like my grandparents were really into birding, and so like I could hear the mourning dove is like that you that's from the end of its song, right?
Yeah, it is.
And then certainly connecting that with the desire to understand bird song, right? This very like 17th, 18th, 19th century, like if we can just sort of sketch out the world and taxonomize all of it, then we'll get it, we'll control it, we'll understand it, right?
Even this idea of like an Adamic language, like we, like Adam could, name things. We could imagine a sort of one-to-one correspondence between like an animal and its name.
Right. And the mourning dove is supposed to be a mourning animal, right? And of course it's not. It's just a bird. Right?
So they're called mourning.
They're
in that
called
sense of mourning, not just the early morning doves. But again, that made me
definitely
think.
a pun.
The morning.
But the other thing I think about there, though, right, is that, like, again, maybe she's making a rejoinder to Linneaus, right, sort of rejection, because, like, when you go out and you're by the snow grave and you're listening to the bird, all you hear is you hear yourself, right? You're not actually seeing anything in nature other than a reflection of yourself.
But I feel like the grave actually is in the same stanza, So I feel like putting the word mourning with the grave, in that sense, it seems like observing and being in nature maybe is a way to sort of honor whoever this is that has passed away, or maybe he doesn't recognize it. I don't know, but there might be something there.
I think it's not like a rejection of anyone else. It's just a rejection of like the human transcending the human, right? That like the more. The speaker hears the mourning dove around the snow grave, which is sort of like quiet scene, but the you there sort of makes it feel like pathetic fallacy, right? That's just the mourning dove song, but because the speaker is going to the grave, they're gonna hear it as like you.
Yeah, you feel like it's a loaded.
Right.
It also made me think of Sid Coleman's poem. The one that ends, "If only you are," and it just made me think. I know that's a massive stretch, but I know they were friends as
Well,
well.
they knew each other,
And
yeah.
and I suppose that if only you are, that sound just really like resonated with me when I read it. And I suppose this could be very much like an invocation to the reader. The you are you. I'm speaking directly to you, and the here as well, the imperative.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry.
No, go ahead.
How incredible that this poem travels from a very sort of like objective view of, you know, a flower in the ground, and then travels like to this lyrical moment. Like this is sort of like an exemplary lyrical moment where like we have the poet trying to speak to nature and like trying to hear something back, and then that's sort of subverted because it turns out that nature can only like reflect back to us what we are.
But it's also, it seems to be giving you presence, right? Like, I mean, what I love about this poem is I don't know where Niedecker sort of falls, right? Is hearing the you are you, is that like sort of like emptiness, like you're just hearing your projection, or is it joyful, or not, maybe not joyful, but like positive presence, right? Of the you, like you are there, right?
Like,
and I think that the Corman, I don't think it's a stretch at all, right? Because like they're not just friends in like an accidental sense. They knew each other because Corman sought her out. As like a sort of like
exchange.
Yeah, exactly. And Corman's absolutely interested in presence in the poem. So I think, I hear it too. That as long as you are, that sort of invocation of being there.
And
the poem kind of like in Corman's poem, the speech, the poet's speech kind of like sustains and enacts and like makes the poem exist and sort of like continuously.
Yeah.
And then hear the Morning Dove's song again continuously. It's like this naming, like reflecting kind of.
I like that. Can we go back to one thing, because I'm curious, I didn't really finish explaining what I was trying to say, and I want to see what you guys think. If the first two stanzas are sort of Linneaus or his setting, and the last one as well, and the third one might be Niedecker. The reason I'm thinking that is because I feel like the first two and the fourth are all sort of describing, even though the last one is very, sort of ephemeral, not quite as dense, things that we could place in Lapland, but this third stanza seems to be an outlier and have the I and the clarity. Maybe that is a reading in the sense of her sort of reframing or rejecting some of the things that he did, and she actually has the clarity and understands the relationships better, or things in a different way, even though it's still foggy.
I really,
Maybe the I pronoun is her, and then we jump back and sort of see him again in the scene, right?
I like that reading, but for me, I think I read the whole thing as well. I read a lot of it. I read that stanza as Linneaus purely because of this sensory. Almost all of the senses are represented. Like, there's I see, I walk, I carry, all these kind of present tense verbs. It's like she's putting herself in the mode of this person who's gone out into a complete wilderness, who wants to be entirely self-contained, who doesn't really want to interact with, and is looking at the people as a sort of anthropological subject. So I don't know. I imagine her just laying out Linneaus.
Oh wow,
that's kind of neat. So you think in that reading that my clarity is for Niedecker sort of presumptuous, that he thought he had this clarity, but maybe he's only seeing specific things and not really seeing I like that.
And so then the final stanza is like what happens when this very self-contained person encounters the song of the Morning Dove.
Yes, that's
works,
really good.
So can I offer a different reading?
Yes.
And this is what I really like about, one of the things I really like about this poem, is that, we've been talking throughout as if the speaker is Linneaus, but it's not clear that this is Linneaus, right? We said in those early stanzas, like this could be Sweden or it could be the Wisconsin of Niedecker sort of thinking through the Linneaus mode, but not actually being in his voice. And I think this is so different than the sort of persona poems of a writer like ModPo, right? Where you're very clearly,
there's much more nuance.
Yeah, and sort of unclear and hazy. And so, I mean, I guess, to your question, I don't know if we're ever in her head or Linneaus' head. I love that.
It would be interesting to read this poem as if the only thing that she takes from Linneaus would be a sort of like attitude with respect to nature, And I think I go back to the first line of the poem, nothing worth noting, which sets us up in a sort of discourse of notation and makes all the moments of the poem actually kind of happen in a time of writing.
Well, that reminds me as well, that nothing worth noting of the Corman poem being like, I'm about to talk about nothing.
Yeah.
And then the whole poem goes on to explore this whole like area that's being kind of trodden upon and looked at and explored, but nothing worth
Just
noting.
like
So
the ground.
So it's sort of it's
Yeah.
a ploy. It's just a
And I think if we can think about Niedecker's having a political project, he is interested in sort of the nothing or the thing that's not noted, right? Like the popcorn can covering the hole,
Mhm.
popcorn can cover covering the hole in the wall, right?
The
thing,
plumbing.
yeah, the thing that would not be in anyone else's poem.
The,
It is nothing. It is not worth noting, but she's the one noting that.
Yeah.
And I think that line is very easy to read as very sort of clinical, the scientific, anthropologic. He was there, oh, there's nothing to note here, not interesting. But then we actually do get, like you said, a list of a lot of things worth noting and that are interesting.
I really like that, what you said about she's the only one who's taking interest in these things. And that's where she sees a parallel with this man who went and looked at all these small tiny things. I think maybe my reading is changing a little to seeing, or just a fusion of the two of them.
And maybe it becomes a question of what happens when you focus and you look at those very tiny things. Do you find anything?
Yeah.
And the poem doesn't answer that question, I don't
No.
think, which makes it all the stronger.
That's a good place to end.